Hello, Suresh ji.
Nice to be here.
Welcome to Perth Dialogues podcast.
Looking forward to talking to you, Nirmal. Very interesting.
I've been trying to get to you to this discussion for some time, especially from the time when I moved to City of Bayswater and I joined their Inclusion and Diversity Committee.
Ah,
And I was reading through what the committee does
Yep.
through its previous meetings, and I realized that you have been the chair of that committee for some time.
I was, and I actually gave it away only because I moved out of the area. So I now live in Stirling, and I didn't think it was appropriate for me to continue to chair that. It's interesting because when I was chairing that was when I actually wrote the state disability strategy for the government. So the government had commissioned People with Disabilities WA, and they employed me to write that, and I wrote that and did that whole strategy. So that strategy that's lying around the place somewhere in government is one that I had a fair bit to do with. So that's how I got involved with the Access and Inclusion Committee as well at Basie.
Good. So I got to know more about you, and then I met Amu,
Yes,
your mother.
my mum.
And then she told me he has moved to Stirling, and I said, that's good for me in a
Yeah.
sense, because the radio is located in Tuart Hill, which is in Stirling.
Yes.
So probably it will be easier to catch you. And finally, we are here.
I actually used to live just about one street down from this radio station. So, it actually would have been even more perfect, but I moved from here a little bit further out, but still very close. Took me about 7 minutes to get here.
And I was just reading, when I was reading about the committee and about you as well, you have a long history. I mean, I know that you started with your studies in Bachelor of Commerce,
Yep.
a degree from UWA, and Masters in Business Administration from UWA, and whole lot of studies and teaching in the same universities. But mostly you are known for your work in media, about speaking about multicultural issues and involvement in peak bodies, especially ACCWA.
Yeah, that's interesting, Nirmal. Actually, when I first started on radio, I was actually a financial planner. So, as a financial planner, my job on radio was telling them what happened in the markets overnight. So this is what happened to the Dow overnight. This is what happened to the FT 100 in London. This is what the gold price did, etc. So that was a everyday morning report. Interestingly, the radio station that I worked on, which was a commercial radio station, 6PR, Talkback Radio, for whatever reason, they liked my voice. And they said, look, got a great voice for radio. Why don't you do a few other things? And then I started doing a few other bits, and that's how I actually got to know people in Perth, and people got to know me in Perth. And in about 2007, I left the financial planning industry. So we'd gone from, started in 1987. I was working for a firm that was already in existence. Then a couple of years after that, in 1992, we bought the firm, put it under our own names. So we had, 4 of us who owned the business. We took the business from a zero starting point to managing about $260 million of client money. So it was a big firm. Had quite a number of staff and so on. In about 1998 or thereabouts, the Ethnic Communities Council approached me and asked me if I would come on board as treasurer on their board. And I got elected that year to be a treasurer that year. And then a couple of years later, they asked me if I would take over the presidency. And I started to take that over. And all through this time, I was still a financial planner. But in 2007, I had to make a decision. I was spending so much time doing community work that I literally had to make a choice between doing that or looking after my clients. And I really wasn't looking after my clients. So I decided that I would hand over my business to my partners, gave them the business, walked away from that, and concentrated solely on doing voluntary work in the ethnic communities, racism space. In about 2000, not in about, in 2011, I got very sick. I had a period of 3 weeks when I had a heart attack, a quadruple bypass, and soon thereafter they discovered a cancer in my stomach. It was a grade 4 cancer. It was in 21 lymph nodes. It was a go home to die cancer. None of them expected that I would have more than 6 months to live there. So I had to make some decisions about what I did in the future. I needed to really concentrate on looking after myself and surviving. Today, 11 years later, back then they told me that I was going to die within 6 months. At that time, I sat my boys down. My boys were Shaquille, my elder boy, was 9 years old. My younger boy, Rahul, was 7. I sat them down and told them that Dad was going to die. And that's probably the hardest thing I've ever done. Sat them down, told them I was going to die and that they needed to look after Mum. And then I started my chemotherapy, radiotherapy. I had surgery to remove the stomach. I started the chemo and radio. I was having chemo every morning, radio every afternoon. Did about 48 sessions of that straight. And that just about killed me. And I was determined to prove my doctors wrong. I started walking to build up my exercise. I was, before I got sick, about 126 kilos in weight. I was big. After the illness, I was down to about 95 kilos. I lost about 30 just in the illness. Started walking. Today, I weigh 59 kilos. So literally half what I used to weigh at my worst. But I walk 20,000 steps a day. I walk 15 kilometers on average every day. Saturdays, Sundays, I'll do 20, 25 kilometers easily. Not an issue. So I am just as determined today as I am back then to prove my doctors wrong. I go every morning, I go and take photos of the sunrise because I look at that sunrise and say, that's one more sunrise that the doctors said I wouldn't see. I'm still here. I'm still reminding them all. I talked to my doctor who looked after me back then on a regular basis. We've become very good friends. We catch up for coffee and so on. And every time he rings me, he starts the conversation with, I shouldn't be talking to you. And I say, why? And he says, because you're supposed to be dead. Because he had written me off like everyone else. So I guess it's just, I'm a very stubborn person when it comes to that. But one of the things that it did highlight to me, Nirmal, was that I was dealing with physical conditions that I could overcome. There were lots of others that I came into contact with at that time who were dealing with disabilities that they would never be able to change. So I realized that I needed to expand my human rights advocacy, not just for multiculturalism, not just for refugees, but start to look after people with disabilities. And part of that was also, I needed to also look at what First Nations people were dealing with in this country. I have a strong affinity for what the First Nations people are going through, what my Aboriginal brothers and sisters are going through. I worked with many of them in that racism space, and now I work with them in disability spaces. I work with them in a whole lot of other areas, and really work hard to build that relationship so that I'm a trusted advisor. I'm considered by many of them to be a brother. And I am happy to wear that tag and really fight for their rights all the way through. My position's always very clear. Look, I came here as a migrant. I came here as a person who has taken so much out of this country, and the country is theirs. So I need to spend the rest of my life really just saying, thank you for letting me do all these things. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here. If it wasn't for you, I would not be able to succeed in the ways I have. And if I look back, if I always am very conscious of how people rely on me to help them. And for those people who are listening to this broadcast, if you go along Beaufort Street as you come to the corner of Beaufort and Vincent, there's a Hungry Jack's on one corner. Opposite that is a little car park I think it says Beaufort across the front of it. There are 5 murals of people there. I'm one of those murals. And I think that to me is the greatest achievement after my children. My boys are my greatest achievement. And I always say to my boys, my picture's there. I'll haunt you long after I'm gone. You'll remember everything that Dad said to you. But look, I take a lot of. I read a lot. I read a lot of Gandhi's work. I read a lot of Cornel West. I read a lot of the human rights activists around the world. Gandhi's great-grandson, Tushar, is a very dear friend of mine. We have regular conversations about some of the things that Gandhi would have done. And I follow the human... I know that Gandhi can be a very polarizing figure for a number of communities, but I like some of the things that he did in that human rights space, both in South Africa and in parts of India. So I think it's also Nelson Mandela's work, and it's also Desmond Tutu's work. I read a lot of that, and I gain a lot of comfort from seeing what they do. Cornel West is a chap who does a lot of work in America in that human rights space, and he came to Perth, and I met with him. And he said to me, you look after refugees, don't you? And I said, yes. And said, and you look after black people? And I said, yes, I do. So he said, why do you not look after people who are LGBTIQ? And he said, come back to why you look after these two groups. It's because they're human beings. So what's the difference with Aboriginal people? What's the difference with LGBTIQ? You need to look after them because you love them as human beings. And that's my principle. Simple principle is that. I don't care whether you've got a disability. I don't care whether you're LGBTIQ. At the end of the day, you're going to shed blood the same as I do. If I can help you in some way, let me do that. Where do I get that streak from? My dad was very, very clear when we were growing up. He said, when you look at society and it's a totem pole of people, you have yourself at the bottom, you have your family just above you, and you have the community above that. If at any time you're in trouble, the chances are your family is also in trouble. You're going to rely on the community. Therefore, whatever you do, your first priority is to build the community in case you need to get help from them. You then build your family next, and don't even consider yourself. You're the last person on the list. So the approach is just to say, how is this going to benefit the community? And that's a very different perspective to the way white Anglo society has grown. Very much more in keeping with the way we grew up and from places where we come from, where it is very much a sense of community is much stronger than it is here. We do things for each other because we are friends, because we are relatives, but the white Anglo societies right across the world have drifted away from that sense of community, and it's become a sense of personal self. And that's also very selfish as well. So my philosophy is based around that. My philosophy is about trying to make sure that I help every person that needs help. My Facebook page, about half my people are people in Manus, people in Nauru, people locked up in detention centers all over the world. I have friends who are people who will never be able to utter a word, but they consider me a friend because they can talk to me on Facebook and they can talk to me in that. So people with disabilities are also a very important consideration, because I can deal with my illness, I can deal with my aches and pains. They have difficulty to deal with that, but they can with my assistance and my support. So that's what I work towards. And that's very much, my philosophy of driving spaces. And that's why, some of the more high-profile cases that I've done, Aishwarya's case was obviously one of them. And having built a very significant career in media over many, many years, I have a lot of friends in media. So I was always able, in Aishwarya's case, for example, when the family, a friend of the family contacted me, and they come from the same South Indian community that I come from, the Kerala community, the Malayali community. So someone from the community contacted me and said, there's been a death in the community, can you assist? I don't know these people, no idea who they are. I rang them, however, and said, I'll be over at your house in 5 minutes. And I immediately rang Channel 9 and said, can you get one of your reporters down there? Because I think this is going to be a huge story. And I knew I needed the media to help me play it out. So they arrived, I arrived, we did the story, went to air that night, and that's just blown apart our health system completely. Highlighted all of the issues that we had with our health system. Since that time, I have been approached on almost a monthly basis by one or other person who's been disadvantaged by the health system. I am working with one at the moment where the mother has gone to the hospital, delivered the children, and died soon thereafter. We don't know why, we don't know how, the hospital can't tell us how, the coroner's office can't tell us how. That's not acceptable. Go back some years ago, I worked very extensively with the international student community. Got to know the international students very well. There were lots of criminal activities going on, people fighting with each other, and all sorts of things going back, and particularly Indian international students and from the north of India. People were struggling to settle into Australian society. All sorts of issues were being dredged up, and there was lots of acts of racism and so on. Got to work with the Indian student community and the international students extensively, so I still do a lot of work with them. I am desperately worried about the mental health status of a number of these students. The reality is that these are students who've been away from their parents. They're good 5,000 or 6,000 miles away from their parents. They have no significant controlling influences on them here in this country. They're reliant on themselves, and often they fall into bad habits and get involved in all sorts of unfortunate activities. So I see my role as mentoring them. I've proposed to the government for many, many years that we have a system where we pay mentorship allowances to age pensioners to act as mentors to some of these Indian students, or international students generally. I established mentorship programs when I was teaching at university. I used to get all of my past students to act as mentors to international students who were doing the MBA. Worked really well. I acted as mentor to many, many prisoners in Hakea, in other prisons around town. I still go and see a number of prisoners that I talk to, that I engage with. Chap came to me the other day and he said, I ran into him in the city, and out of the blue he said, "Oh, hi, Suresh." And I said, "I'm sorry, do I know you?" And he said, "No, but some years ago I was seriously addicted to alcohol. I established myself in rehab, and I started listening to you on radio." And he said, "You know what? I was driven by what you said on radio. Today I am 3 years alcohol free, and I'm just starting to reconnect with my children." That gave me greater heart than anything else, because I suddenly felt like I'm making a difference to someone's life. And that's all I've always wanted to do, is to make a difference to people's lives. So that when I'm gone, someone will say, "Yeah, he made a difference to me. He gave me some encouragement. He mentored me. He helped me." And on Saturday mornings nowadays, I take part in a mentorship program for students who are struggling for various reasons. Parents in jail, non-English speaking. I spend a couple of hours every Saturday morning mentoring kids up in the northern suburbs of Perth. And again, it's giving back to the community, because someday I will need the assistance of the community. That's all I live for nowadays.
There's a lot to take.
There's a huge amount there.
When I realized listening to that there's multiple areas from which someone can draw inspiration. Your fight with cancer itself is a good example of keep going. Your change of fields from professional accountancy field to advocacy field, maybe even going voluntary work instead of a paid work, that itself is an inspiring story of why someone can find their life's why and go ahead. And then understanding how your work can influence structures, societal structures in many ways. If it's a community, if it's a family, if it's what areas of advocacy I'm going to work for. Those are multiple areas where someone can find their life's purpose.
Yeah, their calling. Yep.
So while I was listening to that, I had a few questions
absolutely.
on those things. So I would like to know more.
Yep.
So basically, when I was reading about you, I thought like, how do I structure this conversation? So I went on ECCWA's website, and I found that ECCA, when you were the president, I think they organized a political conversation before the last federal election, 2019.
Yes.
And created a context document on that, and also had a questionnaire.
Yes.
Which basically would work on what ECCA was working on.
Yeah.
So I thought, that's a good questionnaire. I can put that out thing and maybe pick up some questions which are relevant even today. I mean, all of them are relevant.
Yeah. No.
And then try to know more, because what we learn from multicultural side or even from community side is, there is racism, multicultural people need some support, that's it. But there's more layers to it. There's more nuance to it. So I thought I can just take that questionnaire and structure my questions from there, and that will be a good thing.
Yeah, just let me address that part about the racism and the layers as well. One of the things that I've come to very early in the piece is that there is not a lot of benefit from me calling out an individual for being a racist. because all I do when I call out someone from the Pride Boys or someone from Stormfront Down Under, these are the neo-Nazi groups that exist here in Perth, if I call them out, all they're going to do is to entrench their position and anger towards me. What I can influence, however, is government policies that are systemically racist. So in other words, are there policies that systemically discriminate against Aboriginal people? Are there policies that systemically discriminate against people from our background, from Indian background? So one of the first areas that I worked in going back many years ago was to ensure, and I actually spent a bit of time with the WA Police designing culturally appropriate uniforms so that it's possible for a Sikh man to wear a turban whilst being in the WA Police. It hadn't been done up to that point. And this was 2007, 2008. So we worked with police and designed the uniforms so that a Muslim girl could have a cut in the shirt that did not expose flesh, but allowed her to get her gun if she needed to. So, or gun or weapon, taser, whatever it may be. So until we designed that, there were no Muslim people, Muslim women in WA Police. There were no Sikh men. Now, there are over 20 people of Sikh origin in WA Police. And what it does do is it encourages other people in the Sikh community to say, that's a career I could go for. So all of our structures and policies in this space are designed around the white Anglo-Celtic paradigm because they were put in place by white Anglo-Celtic people. All I do is work with government to say, recognize difference, recognize that there are people who don't fit that, what you consider to be the norm. But the norm in Australia is now 50% of the population is either a migrant or a child of a migrant, over 50%, 54% of the population. So surely we need to have policies that cater for all of these groups. So when we first started here, one of the things we found was that there's a high level of employment of Indian and Chinese people in the public service, up to a level 7. No one above the level 7. Why? Are we not capable enough to do those jobs? So we had to go to recruitment practices, because when we recruit, we always recruit people that look like us, people that have names like ours. You come up with a name like Suresh Rajan and they think, geez, we don't know what his background is. Could be Sikh, could be Muslim, could be whatever. So, what does that mean for us? So, so it's all of those things that are fundamental policies in society that I can influence. I want people to stop thinking about stereotyping. I want people to, and these are recruiters, I want them to stop thinking that if I employ this person, I'll have to have different types of toilets or whatever it may be. So all of those things are things that are really systemically discriminatory, and we need to just make sure that that is addressed. However, all of that discrimination, all of that argument that I'll put up for multiculturalism, I will not do it if it further disadvantages Aboriginal people. My first priority is always, I want to make sure that I have these policies in place, but I don't want those policies to discriminate and further colonize Aboriginal people. So it has to be in the context of another set of rules and policies for Aboriginal people that recognizes their disadvantage and says, we need to work to resolve the disadvantage we created for you. your lower life expectancy, your poorer health outcomes. Why is that happening in this country? Shouldn't be. Shouldn't be. And even when we were dealing with Aishwarya's case, for example, I kept looking at that and thinking, yes, they've got an advocate, someone who's as strong as I am in that advocacy space. What of the Aboriginal people who are coming here from the Northwest for medical treatment and don't speak the language? There are people up in the Northwest for whom English is their fifth language. They speak 5 dialects of 5 languages of Aboriginal people before they even come to English. So how do they deal in a system that is so heavily dependent on you being able to communicate what's wrong with yourself in the health system? So we need to deal with that. What are the language services that are available to people like us who may be struggling? We may be put into a legal environment where we need to have a document translated. What's the issue? Simple example. My father-in-law, my wife is born in Australia, but father-in-law was Russian. Mother-in-law was German, Czechoslovakian. Mum and dad came to Australia in the 50s. Both my wife and her sister were born here. They said to the 2 children, mum and dad said to the 2 girls, don't speak to us in Russian, don't speak to us in German, because all you're going to do is, when you go to school, you're going to be teased for being a commie, you're going to be teased for being a kraut, all of those things. Plus, we want to learn English. So when you go to school, learn English, come and teach us English. They came here with no language skills. So, mum, dad, stopped speaking their language to the girls. Both mum and dad went through dementia and Alzheimer's. One of the things that people don't recognize is that dementia and Alzheimer's causes you to revert to first language. Mum and dad started speaking a language that their only 2 children could not understand. They went from diagnosis of their condition to death in 6 months because they're so totally isolated. They couldn't speak a word to anyone. We're doing that in the Arabic-speaking community. We're doing that in the Indian communities. We're doing that in the Punjabi communities. We're telling our children, speak to us in English so that we can learn English. But our children are not learning our language. My mother was very clear with us when we were children. Speak to me in English and I will not respond. So we had to learn Malayalam, despite the fact that we have never lived in Kerala. Yeah, I've gone visiting, but I've never lived there. I can manage Malayalam very comfortably enough to speak on radio in Malayalam. So we talk about the preservation of language. Yet all of Australia's systems and principles are designed around English. And yet 50% of our population is born overseas. So it really is a very, very difficult. It's just trying to get the policymakers to understand this. Even when you consider things like, there are systems of law, the systems of culture that we practice. We should be allowed to continue to practice those systems of culture. You should be allowed to go to the Gurdwara. Why not? I should be allowed to go to my temple if I wanted to. The early days of settlement was leave your culture at the door, at the airport, at the wharf, because once you come in, you become Australian. You become white, English-speaking, Catholic. No longer the case. So it's coming to terms with all of that. And Australia's dealing with a change that they haven't seen in the past. They're seeing the hijab, they're seeing the turban, they're seeing the dark skin on us, and they're not sure what to make of all of that. So we're growing up, and I see it as my role as a person who understands those things, having grown up in Brunei and Singapore and India and so on. I have a familiarity with all of those cultures. It's my job to teach the lawmakers, the policymakers, the governments about what they need to change to accommodate us as equal members of society. And one of the best people we had in that space was Dr. Jeff Gallup. Jeff was one of these people who understood that completely and utterly, and he worked very closely. Every policy of multiculturalism in place in WA was created by Jeff when I was president of the Ethnic Communities Council and worked with him very closely. Brilliant man, brilliant. But since that time, there has been no strong commitment to multiculturalism like he had. But we'll keep talking about it, and we'll keep reminding them that we exist. We are major contributors. Big sign at the Ethnic Communities Council that says, we're ethnic, we pay taxes, we vote. That's a reminder to every politician that comes in. We're ethnic, but we're taxpayers, and we vote. So, just a reminder, that's all.
Okay, so let me use those questions to you. So what does multicultural means to you? And because everyone has got their own meaning to multiculturalism, and if we are advocating for multiculturalism, what are we actually advocating for?
Yeah. That's a brilliant question, Nirmal, because there is a misconception in our community that multiculturalism is about the Bangara, the chaat, so it's the food, it's the polka and the pasta. That's not what multiculturalism is. That's cultural diversity. And there's a significant difference between cultural diversity and multiculturalism. Cultural diversity is something that governments have no control over. While they don't have a border to this country, while we bring people in from overseas, they have to deal with cultural diversity. It's a given. Multiculturalism is government policy that deals with that difference. How do they deal with the difference? So it's about government policy that says, we will not, for example, give you a simple example. We worked very hard with the WA Police to allow Sikh devotees, and particularly the ordained Sikhs, to be able to carry the dagger. But certain conditions attached to that, it had to be plastic and all of those things, so it didn't represent a threat. But that's the sort of thing that we say, that's multicultural policy, because that's a policy of government that says, how do we deal with your difference in religion, your difference in eating habits? So it's not about the diversity, it's about the policies of how we deal with that. How do we deal with the fact that in our communities, the sense of family is much stronger, and it's not unusual for extended families to live together. But when you look at the definition of family in the Immigration Act, it talks about father, mother, and children. That's it. So it's that Western definition of family as opposed to ours, which would be the first cousin is still family. Second cousin is also family. So it's really about saying, so when we talk about, oh, that's a family member or that's a relative, it's for the Anglo community, they find it difficult to understand what that's about, whereas we've got this much extended family. So it's things like that. It's about aging parents who always live with us, we look after, we wouldn't consider putting them in a home. Whereas Ken Wyatt, the Minister for Aging, at one time used to say, there are people here whose only contact with their parents is when they go to the cemetery to go to the graves of their parents once a year, on the day of their birthday or on Mother's Day or Father's Day. That's it. That would be completely unacceptable in our concept. So it is those things. It is about the way we choose to live our lives. And multiculturalism is about the policies of government that allow us to practice our culture, our religion, our language, the way we've always done.
So I have been grappling with a very relevant question on that thing. How do we deal with families? Because Australia's migration policy, the whole migration policy, is based on the premise that we will take educated, skilled young people into Australia who will come and pay taxes for 30, 40 years, which taxes will then subsidize some other welfare payments.
Yes.
Be it NDIS, be it aged care, child care, whatever it is. That's the model.
Yep.
And also because Australians' mainstream total fertility rate has fallen so much that it can't replace the existing population. So you need to depend on migration to build that population again. Those two things.
Yep.
What it does is it separates the children at the peak of their productivity and the time when their parents need those children away from them, leaving the parents to fence off on their own in a faraway land away from their children. And the parent visa timeline today is 40 years.
40
years.
Wow.
If you are happy to pay $100,000 for that.
Yes.
And your expression of interest will come in 12 years after you have paid half of the fees. By the time my parent might not even be alive to pay the second half of the fees and then wait another 30 years. So I am wondering that Australia's prosperity in a part is paid for or built upon
migration,
breaking someone else's flourishing family.
Yes. And that is a real problem because, we need nurses here, for example. We need doctors. We go and take those doctors and nurses from India. What are we doing to that population? We've taken away all the skilled doctors and nurses. And it would actually make sense for those doctors and nurses to be able to bring their family over here, look after them here, but instead of which they separate, as you say. You've taken away at the most productive because they're under 40 when their migration status changes. So you're right. It is a huge problem.
And that's where the second part is that if we start allowing anyone to bring their parents permanently, then it defeats the whole initial issue of having these people come in.
Yes.
I mean, my parents are in India.
The
I can't bring them
diversity.
Here permanently. And that's what I'm thinking. How do we solve this problem that parents can stay with their children for longer and especially in the time when they need their children the most without affecting the initial premise of the whole migration policy?
I think the only way you can do that is to continue to have a migration system that says we're happy for your parents to come out. However, there's a residency period before they can access any benefits from here. It may be 10 years, maybe 15 years. So you bring your parents over, but you're responsible for looking after them for the first 15 years. In that time, you would have paid enough in taxes to now allow them to start to draw some of that money that you paid in taxes as well. But again, it comes back to that tax system also not recognizing anyone other than individuals. I mean, even if you get down to the point where you start to say, I have paid X number of dollars of tax. My wife has been at home looking after the children. Can she not access the tax that I've paid? No. She's treated as a separate taxpayer. So when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of looking at the contributions individuals make, our tax system is very, very clear. It just looks at you as an individual. So I think those are fundamental aspects that need to be dealt with. But I think it goes back to the definition of, well, I guess it's about our community structures that define a family. Our community structures in places like India, Southeast Asia, etc., are very much more around family businesses, families who live together, family homes that get passed down, ancestral homes, and they are shared amongst children, and children staying with parents for much later in life than it is here. Whereas we've tended to have a system in Australia for the last couple of 100 years. And that's why I see a lot of similarities to First Nations people. For First Nations people, communities are absolutely essential. They don't go out to work for themselves. They go out so that they have shared wealth. You set up a house and all the family members will come and live in that house. Not a problem. Yeah, it's normal for them. But it's very different to Anglo-Celtic society, which is, nuclear family. That's how it's structured. And have little, and then it becomes a society of competition. My family needs more than your family, or my family is going to accumulate more than your family because I want my children to benefit. So, then it becomes a horrible competition. Whereas if your first focus was, I'm going to make X number of dollars and I'm going to pour it all into the community to build a park, a place where people can go and enjoy themselves, a place where they can access food. It's all of those social activities. So it's everything about saying, I can put back into the community everything I take out of it. Then you've got a sustaining community. But that's generations of change that will take that.
It's a very interesting point where actually I was reading something on some other topic.
Yeah.
When someone said that Australia is very rich and why can't it take in some more people? And I actually went back to check ABS statistics on these things. And I found that the median or average income, a weekly income of an average Australian family is about $2,000.
Right.
And then I said, that's very rich compared to world over PPP standards. But then I checked the weekly expenses of an Australian family. And it's more than the weekly income.
Oh, really?
Yes. So,
wow.
So today, 23, a median average income is about $22,000. And the expenses is $2,100.
Wow.
And it let me thinking that if that is the case, we are not rich.
No.
We are 0-0.
No.
So we have no money to spend on anything, especially when the government taxes so much.
Yeah.
And when you spoke about that, I contribute towards society, there is nothing left in someone's pocket to contribute to the society because someone else has already taken out all the things.
Yes.
Just now, the government has taken out even the median and low medium offset.
Yes, the offset
$1,500.
Yep.
In a year, that would contribute to about $100 a month, and that's even taken out.
Wow.
So there's nothing there in anyone's pocket to spend anything on community.
And it's quite fascinating to see the focus of government and people to say, all these big corporations, we expect them to have a corporate social responsibility. Uh, well, actually, the first port of call should really be government, because they're taking money from you. It's a guaranteed income that they've got from taxation, so they should be the ones who are putting more money back into the community and putting it into things that will benefit everyone in the community. It's corporate social responsibility. Yes, absolutely. Governments are pushing very hard to have corporations do it, and some of the big corporations are doing it very well. They do a lot of work in all sorts of places, but I don't think they direct it very well. I think there's a lot more work that can be done towards seeing how they direct that so that it keeps going round.
Another thing
Yeah.
which I want to talk to you, because that's another rabbit hole to go into about
Yes.
corporate social responsibility.
Oh, yes.
And how we can actually enrich
sure-
our community. That's
Yep.
a whole different topic to
Yeah.
discuss on, and especially because I run a business myself for 6 years.
Okay.
So I have got my own views on what I can do and what I should be doing and
Yep.
what my responsibilities are. But I wanted to talk to you about something that we discussed earlier before moving on to the First Nation
Yes.
issues, because that's a very important and a very topical issue these days.
Yep.
We talked about, you had a very strong views about when the federal government made Perth a regional place and started pushing or diverting many students to Perth and I think Gold Coast.
Yes.
So you had strong views.
I have, and I remain. International students have become one of the greatest exports of this country. It is second now to mining. So that's how much money we're making in international student fees and so on.
It's $40 billion before COVID.
Yeah. My concern lies in the fact that we have started to view international students as this giant ATM. We actually give them very little in exchange for the fees they pay, the visa charges that we put on people, etc. For example,
And if I may stop you, what does we means? If we means the universities, or we
no.
means the state, or we means the country?
I mean the country.
Okay.
Yeah. As a country, so when COVID hit, a lot of the students were coming from places where COVID was much more rampant than it was here. Most of them had parents who had lost their jobs. We continued to charge them full fees. We continued to charge them full accommodation rates, but we didn't give them job seeker, job keeper. We did not allow them to access those. To me, that was wrong. I don't have a problem if you say, okay, job keepers not available. Oh, and the other thing we did also was, of course, we already have a restriction on the amount of work they can do. So how are they going to pay their fees if their parents are out of jobs? They can't work more than 20 hours a week. And then we reduced that even further because they were doing jobs that had contact. So all of a sudden, we're now in that space where these kids were literally had nothing. We saw a whole stack of it, and I'll talk mainly about the Indian community here because that was the group that I had much contact with. Number of Indian students who walked away from their rental agreements and moved in with their friends. Now, all of a sudden, we had 20 people in a home, defying all of the social distancing rules that we put in place in COVID. So I guess it was that concerned me. We've taken these people who are, as I said earlier, thousands of miles away from their parents, but provided nothing to deal with their mental health status. They couldn't access mental health issues. There was a college here in the southern suburbs. The principal said to me one day, they had a student who had saved up money driving taxis to send home. This was pre-COVID, to send home so that his parents could marry off the 3 sisters. He'd saved up $12,000. Wandered across to the casino one night, blew the lot. Now we were placing him on suicide watch because there's every likelihood he was going to commit suicide because of what he'd done here. What we should have been doing is addressing his mental health status. Should have been dealing with that, but we weren't dealing with that. We're the only state in Australia that does not fund a transcultural mental health network. And what we mean by that is psychologists and psychiatrists who are conversant in language, understand the culture, and actually come from the culture or have the lived experience of that culture. We are the only state that doesn't fund it. Why? So that was my concern in regard to sending students here. The services were not here. I guess I go back to when we were dealing with those issues back in 2007, 2010. Over a period of time, I transported many, many deceased bodies back to India and to other parts of the world of international students that had either killed themselves, killed each other because of their mental health status, because they got into debt, because their visas were cancelled, whatever the reasons were. But no one recognized their suicide status. So they were committing suicide, they were killing each other, they were fighting with each other, and I was ending up sending the bodies back home. I'm happy for the students to come here. I am delighted when students come here because we're giving them an opportunity they would not have got back home. But I want to make sure that we deal with them as human beings. We want to deal with their mental health status. And that's really important.
And this was what my second part of the question was, because you had these views, and these are very potent views. The government and in these about last 2 years, we have been facing huge housing crisis, rental crisis. I think I saw a figure there that there's 150,000 homeless people on the streets. And the government is bringing in 400,000 new immigrants over the next 2 or 3 years, which will expound and just make this position even worse, where these people the new incoming people will not have the houses to rent, or, buying is later down the line, but first is renting issues, finding jobs, finding places to live, movement. The infrastructure is not there. Everything is crumbling, and you bring in more people. I'm an immigrant, so I'm not against immigrants. No. But I'm just thinking, we had seen these issues earlier when the government changed the rules and during the COVID period. So why are we doing it again? What should we be doing it differently?
Shouldn't we have been training people back then for the shortages that we've got now?
Should we be doing something else? Or how can we solve this? How can we solve this?
Let me say, as a starting point, one of my bugbears has been that there are currently about, I think the figure is 19,000 people in immigration detention around Australia and in Manus and Nauru. Most of them from Manus and Nauru have been brought back on shore, but there are all these people in detention centres. We have no idea what their skills are. We have never done an audit to find out if these people are carpenters, these people are bricklayers. Some of them have been in detention for 10 years. Chap I was talking to last week, in detention for 12 years now. What a waste. You know what we were saying about their most productive years? His most productive years are in detention. Why? So, some of these skills may exist. Why are we going overseas to find fruit pickers? They're in detention here. You don't need to go far. They're already here. They don't need to come from overseas. So you start to look, and the numbers in community detention. There are a whole stack of people in community detention who have bridging visas that have no work rights. How are you expecting them to survive? They've got a bridging visa, that's got no work rights. That's illogical. So why don't you start doing that? Why don't we start going and looking at the people who are already here, looking at what skills they've got? One of the other things that we've got to do, recognition of prior learning. You come here from overseas with a MBBS. From India, where you deal with conditions that you'll never see in this country. Surely that person's already got the qualifications to be able to practice as a doctor here. Put them through an exam to start off with, just to test them. Why do that? And I came across a situation just the other day, which is rather bizarre. 2 girls who came here from parts of Africa. They're black African girls. They've done their nursing degrees here. So they've come in on student visas, did their IELTS test to come in, did their degrees here in nursing, in English, done their IELTS tests again, because APRA, the registration authority, has a higher level than the immigration department. So they've got the immigration level, APRA wants them to get a higher level, and they failed. They both did their degrees in English here. So they failed that. And so now they're doing other things. They're cleaners, etc. It's just those inconsistencies that really bug me. If we address those things, there are some. I remember when there at the Ethnic Communities Council, there was a chap who used to come and clean the office. And one night I'm working late and he's come in and I've said, and he always addressed me as professor, as a mark of respect, as a lovely man. Anyway, we got chatting and I said to him, what did you do back in your country? And he said, I was in government. I said, oh, yeah, okay, what were you? He said, I was the ambassador for my country to this other country, but none of my qualifications in politics and political science are recognized here. He's my cleaner. He was his country's ambassador. I think, you're kidding me, aren't you? Surely that's the classic example of someone whose prior learning we need to recognize. Prior learning, prior experience. Those are the things that we still have a lot of work to do. Why is it that ECU decided to ban all students from 2 states in India? Why? Because there were 7 people from the 69 universities in those 2 states combined that had cheated on their applications. So now we're not taking any students from all 69 universities. That's wrong. So it's again, it all comes back to that. You apply this one set of criteria, but you're not taking into account individual differences. And that is something that we need to spend a lot more time understanding.
That's in our nature. I realized in many cases that one thing goes wrong and then they try to change the whole system for that one thing.
Yes.
Indian driving licenses were accepted for conversion and a few people cheated, and then now every Indian who comes has to get a certificate from the same Indian government saying that their license is correct. It's like, what's going on? If I can cheat on a driver license, I can cheat on the certificate as well.
Absolutely.
So I'm not sure what's going on. Same thing with the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act. So something happened at one place where one company destroyed one heritage, and now the whole state
is
every
subject to that.
person, every land has to be checked and
Yes.
ticked and thing, because we can't do that thing again. And I don't know how much issues that will create.
Yeah.
And this gives a good segue into my very topical question, on which I'm trying to get to for some time.
Yeah.
So the question in that questionnaire for the parties was, will your party enact the Uluru Statement from the Heart,
Yes.
call for the establishment of a First Nations voice?
Yep.
So we are going through the voice process, and a Makarata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making and truth telling
Yes.
between governments and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Of all those 3, 4, 5 topics, Uluru Statement
Yeah.
and First Nation Voice and Makarata Commission
Yep.
and agreement making and truth telling, I know only one, which is voice.
Yeah. And that's
You help
interesting.
me understand
Absolutely.
all those 5. What's the relationship?
Yeah.
And what's the sequence after which it will come?
Okay. What happened was, back in 2017, they decided to create a group of Aboriginal people coming together.
And who's they? The government.
The government, sorry,
Okay.
federal government. Yeah, brought a whole group of Aboriginal people that represented pretty much the whole country, and to go out and have dialogues and truth-telling sessions with all of the different communities all around the country. So they had 13 or 14 sessions in different parts of the country, and people attended. Aboriginal elders attended, and it was a case of really understanding what were the issues involved there. From that, this group of Aboriginal people created the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, and I saw the original document in Melbourne a couple of years ago, last year, and it's one of my friends was involved in part of the writing of that. It sets out a whole series of rules as to how white Australia will deal with Aboriginal Australia. Okay, it's about recognizing the massacres that existed back then. It's about the truth telling as to how people have been dealt with over the years. The Makarata Commission was really this group of people, and that is their language that they use to say, we want a Makarata to create this commission that will be responsible, and that commission will have a voice to Parliament. Now, we've got to be really careful with this voice to Parliament, and that's the one that we're dealing with at the moment. So the Uluru Statement said that we needed to have, as part of the whole reconciliation process, we need to have a Makarata, which is a commission. We need to have a truth-telling. We need to have the voice to Parliament. Now, a lot of people are getting confused there. The voice to Parliament is not a voice in Parliament. We've got to be really careful about that. We're not saying that this is a commission that's going to sit in Parliament. To me, this is no different to the number of groups that I belong to. I belong to People with Disabilities Australia. I belong to various multicultural commissions. I have a voice to Parliament by making recommendations to my minister, who will take it to Parliament. This is no different. All they're saying is this is going to be a voice to Parliament to bring Aboriginal only on matters that impact on Aboriginal people. Now, this is not a decision-making body. All it is giving advice to the government. So why do we need to change the constitution to make it that way? Because every time we've had a commission like this, a committee like this, the next government that comes in abolishes that one.
And builds a new one, or
And
it just
builds a new
abolishes?
one.
Okay.
Yeah. So you've gone from, one particular commission, committee, to now having the at-sea and then you have the National Aboriginal Congress, and you've got all these different ones, right? So each one gets demolished by the next government that comes in, so it lasts about 3 years. So what this one says is that the reason why we want to do it in the Constitution is that it can't be changed by government. You have to go to the people. So in the first instance, it's put in the Constitution by the people, by us voting, and it can only be taken out by us voting to take it out. So you want it to last longer than the term of this government. So to me, it just makes logical sense. One of the common things that we hear on this is to say, why, what difference will it make to the person up in Newman? Reality is that nothing we've done up to this point has worked. We still have a lower life expectancy. We still have social disadvantage. We have illnesses that don't exist anywhere in the world. Nothing has worked up to this point. All we're saying now is that now we're going to allow this group of Aboriginal elders who will give advice to government as to what they need to do in Newman, as to what they need to do in Alice Springs to address the health issues, to address the life expectancy issues, all of those things. So my position is very clear. If nothing's worked up to this point, what have we got to lose by trying this? If it doesn't work, let's go back to the people and say the Constitution, or let it remain there. It's up to the government to decide whether the advice they get from the voice they're going to listen to. Nothing's changed there. They still have the ultimate sanction to decide whether they implement a policy or not. So if this group came along and said, we want to do this, this, and this in Alice Springs, it's up to government still to decide. It's up to Parliament to decide. So they've got no jurisdiction to go ahead and put policies in place. All they can do is make recommendations to ministers. No different to the sort of things that I do now, where I make recommendations. The government says, that's a load of rubbish, throw it out. Or, yeah, we might listen to that. Let's do something to that. So it is, to me, it's quite simple, really. It's giving a bit more, I guess, input into legislation and policy from Aboriginal people, from the people who it's going to impact on.
And how does that affects when the proposed voice is also a voice to the executive government as well, not just to the Parliament?
Yeah, it's and again, whatever the executive government wants to put in place, it's going to bring to Parliament anyway. Executive government cannot go ahead and do something, put in new legislation or whatever, without it going through Parliament. So it still will be something that the Parliament ultimately decides. Or executive government says, we're not interested. It's ultimately their decision. It's not the Aboriginal people's decision. All they're doing is providing advice to executive government and to Parliament to say, can you take this up on our behalf?
And how does that relate? I understand your things. How does that relate to agreement making and then truth telling?
Yeah, agreement making. The truth telling part of it is being upfront and recognizing that these things did happen and they were caused by white people. So all of the matters of disadvantage, Fiona Stanley said it very nicely the other day. She said, every item of disadvantage when you look at for Aboriginal people, life expectancy, health issues, etc., all of that's been caused by colonization. They were diseases that didn't exist here. Their life expectancy was perfectly normal before. So alcohol was not something that they had an issue with at all until it was introduced to them. So it's really about saying we recognize that the truth is this is what happened. There are still people out there who deny that any massacres occurred. So this is about saying we need the truth to be told. Because what people haven't recognized is that by denying that as the truth, we're bringing children up who are thoroughly confused as to why their parents are in this disadvantage and why they are in a disadvantage. And all it comes down to is almost an intergenerational anger. But if we have the truth and the colonizers say, yes, we were the cause of that, then I think it's much easier for them to accept that it wasn't their parents and their grandparents that did that led them to be in this position. So truth telling is really important. Agreement making is really about saying, look, we cannot do anything unilaterally. We've got to come together with the mainstream community and come into agreements to get an outcome. But we have to have an agreement as to what the outcome is. So we've got to come to agreements between us and the government to say, this is what we want to achieve for our society. We want to have a much more, we want to have life expectancies that are commensurate with white people. We want to have alcohol abuse removed from our communities. How do we do that? We've got to come to an agreement as to how this is. So it's about, rather than saying, we want one thing, you want something else, we're never going to meet in the middle. We've got to come to some agreement to say, we'll come some way, you come some way, and let's meet in the center and somehow develop that. So it's, look, are they utopian? Are these things that can be achieved? We don't know. But the voice is a starting point to say we'll get to that point.
Okay, so voice is a starting point towards truth telling and then to
agreement making. Yep.
And is this agreement making the same as treaties?
No.
Is it different?
Treaty is a whole different concept altogether.
So what's that?
The Waitangi Treaty is probably the only one we can look at, where there was a treaty right from the early days. It was that white man said to the Maoris, here's a treaty. We're coming to peace, basically. So we're going to forget all about the conflicts that may have existed in the past. We are going to start from this point, and we're going to build on this, where we work with each other. So it really is a treaty of cooperation. It's about peace between the two communities. Treaty is a long way down the track. I think Lydia Thorpe has said she wants a treaty, she doesn't want the voice. But you're not going to get to the treaty without the voice. The voice is the one that empowers people to get the ear of government, to at least put things to government. So ultimately the decision making is still by government. Nothing will be given to the Aboriginal community. It's not about self-governance, nothing. It's about them having input into the government's ear to say, can we have these matters taken into account? The government can turn around and say, no, we don't want to. Imagine it's like, let's say, it's the Muslim community that comes along and says, we have a voice to Parliament. One of the voices to Parliament says, we want to have Sharia law here. The government says, no. That's the end of that. So it's no difference. The government will have the final veto and final decision making. All of the voices is an advisory body to say, these are policies that impact on our lives. Can we have input? Can we do this a different way culturally? Can we come to an agreement to deliver this in a particular way that's culturally appropriate and therefore will be more accepted and will be more agreed to by our communities? To me, it's just another means, another advisory group. I belong to a dozen of them, at least.
And my last question before we close, and I'm trying to bring or tie in both the Aboriginal question and the migrant question that we have been discussing, is the Aboriginal and the voice question is between the Aboriginal First Nation and the white colonizing. I mean, that's in brackets or whatever. I'm not saying that they are colonizers. Colonizing white Australia. 54% of the population today is migrants. Where does migrants sit in this equation? Are we colonizers? Or are we part of the First Nation? Or where do we sit?
We run the risk of being considered to be second lot of colonizers if we continue to exploit Aboriginal people. Okay, so if we apply the same white principles that have been applied that were used to colonize Aboriginal people, and we start to implement those same policies in our communities, then we run the risk of being considered to be another lot of colonizers. So I always think of the migrant community as this, what is now defined as the CALD community, culturally and linguistically diverse. I believe that one of the significant elements of the culturally and linguistically diverse community are the Aboriginal community. Okay? Recognizing, however, that they're the First Nations, once you recognize that, they are also part of the culturally and linguistically diverse community. Because when you consider, there is no one Aboriginal community. There are so many countries. There are so many languages. We're now down to about 70 languages. When White Man came here, there were about 250 languages. And they are all distinct cultures and distinct countries. That's why we welcome to country when we go into someone else's country. They welcome us into their country. Or we acknowledge their country when we go to their country. So that's why they are a very culturally diverse community. So I think they're a fundamental part of the culturally and linguistically diverse community, but they have a unique position as First Nations people as well. First Nations people, but culturally and linguistically diverse. So that's why I encourage the migrant communities to really embrace the Aboriginal community and bring them on, whilst recognizing that they're the First Nations people, treat them as very much equal, if not as a special status.
On that note, I think we can conclude this chapter of our discussion and
happy to continue
dialogue, because I saw that there were 18 questions in that questionnaire and we have covered only 2.
Well, yeah, I think the last time I did an interview like this was we intended to do it as a one session of 45 minutes. We ended up with 5 sessions.
That's how I think it is going to be.
Not a problem.
It's a wonderful conversation and can go into multiple areas and rabbit holes.
Happy
and yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for the time and finding this when you have to run and do a lot of other things.
Not a
and
problem
walk
at all.
those 25 kilometers.
That's it. Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Hello.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Do like, subscribe, and share on whichever platform you have heard this. To know more about Perth Dialogues, please visit perthdialogues.au. From everyone in the studio, goodbye.